Okay, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining and those watching this recording later on. My name is Lee Wright. I run the field enterprise team at Confluent. I have been asked to moderate a fantastic panel here today on people hiring and scaling in open source companies on behalf of Open UK, a wonderful organization that is doing excellent good promoting open source in all its forms in the United Kingdom, including helping people start and found companies around it, contribute to open source, as well as doing overall good with open source, including reducing the effect of climate change and other benefits for humankind. We've got three fantastic panelists with a wide variety of experiences on today's panel, who are going to go through everything from how we look to find your first co-founder all the way through to scaling into obviously some of the largest companies in the world have open source at their core and have been through that challenges. So without further ado, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves and share a bit about their background in open source, and then we'll get into the topic at hand. So Murielle, would you please start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see, my name is Murielle. I work at Confluent, where I lead a team of people business partners for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Prior to joining Confluent, I've always worked in tech, from startups to large companies, really different sizes, always with an international setting. And one thing that is really important to me, one step of my career, is I worked for small open source companies back in France, working on OpenStack as a technology, grew the company from 40 people to 150 people. And that's how I fell in love really with open source. And a year down the line, the company got acquired by Red Hat. So I also have that sort of experience. So this is now my third open tech company that I work at, and I'm really passionate about it.
Thank you, Murielle. Very much looking forward to your thoughts, especially around that scaling piece and how we hire and the complexities around it. Matt, my first time on a panel with an American. Brilliant to have you on. Could you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Lee. Yes, I'm Matt Yonkovit. I'm the head of open source strategy at Percona. Percona is an open source database company that's been around since 2005. Originally, I got into open source at a variety of companies as a user, and then eventually moved to MySQL AB. So I have over 20 years actually working within an open source company. I have managed a variety of teams, hired hundreds of people from all over the world, over 40 different countries over the years, and have worked through many different stages of growth, from a handful of people all the way up to what Percona size is now, which is over 350.
And Paul.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, my name is Paul Holt. I am Vice President of JetStack Secure, working for a company called Venafi, which specializes in machine identity. JetStack Secure is a product which is on top of an open source project called Cert Manager, which is a hugely popular open source technology there, helping machines identify themselves running within the Kubernetes environments. Prior to Venafi, lots of open source experience. I was lucky enough to be involved with Red Hat in the very, very early days, in the early 2000s, and subsequently went on to work at a number of open source startups, both here in the UK and also over in the US as well. So looking forward to sharing some of my thoughts and experience with people who join us today and the people who are catching up on the recording.
Fantastic. So ultimately, when to hire your first employees ultimately is the sort of the biggest challenge and biggest question, right? along with what skill set those individuals could bring. Being open source obviously brings the sort of niche challenge that you can obviously build on that community before you make those hires, or you can make those hires before you build on that community, and really figuring out where in that journey you should start making those investments, and where, I think, is an incredibly critical decision that will sort of influence the path of success within organizations. So Matt, I think sort of first question to yourself around, what do you think is the right time, and what do you think is the right role, especially for someone building a company around an open source project?
Yeah, I think we're actually in an interesting time, because I think my answer would have been a little different a few years ago. With the funding that has been happening recently, I've seen more and more companies get pre-revenue funding in multi-million-dollar segments. So the ability to hire early many folks into your team has really kind of escalated over the last, let's say, four years or so. And so I have seen a lot of companies that have the revenue streams to build out massive engineering teams without a thought of, how do we monetize this early? How do we bring in money to pay the bills? Percona is a little different, because we're bootstrapped. We've never taken outside funding. So we've had to kind of balance everything out. But what I've seen successful is typically those first hires are focused on the core product themselves, building out the feature set that's going to kind of propel adoption. The classic open source play is get people to get interested in your product, use it, and then start to be willing to either pay for enterprise features or software as a service or some other component. So the faster you can bring the product to market, the better. So typically looking for someone in that product or engineering space is critical, but you also need to find someone who has a lot of capability to play multiple roles. At the smaller size, there's so many different hats you're going to have to wear, from not only the engineering side, but promotion, from doing marketing, from talking on podcasts, doing videos, doing tutorials. So I think early on it's important to start to think about like the broad skill set, having the ability to jump into many roles. And I think you have to start looking at bringing it in when you can afford that first person, and until then just try and grow the community until you reach a point where maybe you've got some seed funding, something else to start with. But typically I'm looking, I'm a fan of having something out there before you make that first hire, so people can kind of see what's out there and get interested in it.
I think, Matt, I think you make a couple of really interesting points there. I would challenge you slightly in respect to, I think the days of getting funding now without being able to really articulate a very, very quick route to revenue, to profitability, are slipping away from us very, very rapidly. And money, just in the past few weeks, money is going to become increasingly tight.
Yes, yeah.
So I think but the point you make, which I think is spot on, is actually the most important thing is when you can afford to. That to me is open source or not is a very, very critical point. Is that you need to be very, very certain that you have something which has longevity behind it in terms of a plan and how you're going to actually generate and how you're actually going to generate money. So for me, the first thing is I can afford to hire somebody. And the questions which I would typically go through then is really, route to revenue. How quickly can I move this to revenue, whether it be an engineering hire, a marketing hire, a sales hire, whatever it may be. And that obviously is dependent on the skill set that you have already. It's how quickly can this head help me to generate revenue. So for me, that would be the overriding thing that I would think about. And I think in the context of an open source perspective, that I think would depend on how mature is the open source project, how how close is it? What do I need to do on top of that to be able to, persuade people to spend money with me? And that will obviously vary technology by technology.
Yeah, Paul, and it's an interesting point because what most people don't realize is for a lot of folks early on, the project is a labor of love. It's not necessarily something that can generate revenue. And that's a good point. How quickly can you generate revenue? Going from a hobby or a labor of love to an actual company, that is a really important inflection point that a lot of people miss.
One thing I'd add, once you've been able to know you're able to hire people, we talked about the multiplicity of skill sets and roles. Another angle I think that is important is also the reputation of the individual, especially with open source. It doesn't have to be exactly in the community or the technology that you're targeting. It can be also a wider community. But one thing that I've seen work really well is we made a couple of key hires in one of my previous companies, a startup I was working at. And it was just, they were pure talent magnets. So when it came to then that further step, once you've started to have more people and have some success, there were certain specific roles I didn't even need to advertise. There were people coming to us because they knew of the names of these individuals. They were very well known in the community. So that's also something to consider.
So it's a fantastic point. I love there wasn't even debate. The initial hire should be a multifaceted, multi-skilled, but engineering-focused individual to help build out the product that you can then take to market, and the rest will follow. Ultimately, once you've got, go on, Paul.
Sorry, Lee. I was going to just on that point again. I think it's important to look at the skills that you have already in terms of what you as a founder bring to the organization. So by way of example, if I were finding that the demands of the business were taking me away from what my core competence was, if it were sort of administration, FP&A, that type of stuff, then that's where I would make the hire. If it were genuinely drawing me away from what the core competence of the business was to be, then that's in my opinion, that's where you should make the hire to allow you to focus on what's really, really important. And obviously everybody's skill set's slightly different. But I suspect a lot of the people who will be listening to this conversation will be, there'll be engineers, there'll be developers, there'll be, through and through. So, maybe it is marketing, maybe it is sales, maybe it is go-to-market, maybe it is the back office that people typically need support. But if those demands are drawing you away from what is going to really make the business successful, that's where you should make that first hire, in my opinion.
Well, one thing I want to add to that specifically is because you're at that stage and there are those different roles that you might not have the experience in, trusting those first hires is so important. So getting the right people that you can trust to take on those roles without having that knowledge, it's so critical, because these are people who are going to come in, they're going to do great things for you, but if that trust doesn't exist, or you don't have that relationship, it's going to cause issues and stumbles early on as well. So just something I wanted to throw out there.
No, I completely agree, and it sort of brings us on to our next topic. I mean, to those first hires are so critical. What process do you see that co-founders can put in place in order to ensure that those first hires are going to continue to work towards the core values and be nothing but assets and benefits to these fledgling businesses as they grow? Murielle, I'll push that to yourself as a first point.
Yeah, I think obviously, apart from the skill set, it's going to be about understanding what are the inherent values of these other employees, and are they in common? Do they align, right? Because these first values, they will build a foundation for anything as well that goes after around the culture. And you've got to make sure that these values are really aligned to Matt's point, being able to trust, and ensure that, you know, even if you're not in the room, the decision that's being made is the right one. You trust these partners, really. So I think really concentrating as well on the core values, what is important, what you're trying to achieve as a company, and making sure you're really aligned is key.
Yeah, I think.
Go on, Matt.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, yeah, I think that, you know, that from an early hire perspective, it's interesting because without a shipped product or something that's, you know, usable, the people that you have represent your company, and that's who people will look to. You mentioned having the talent magnets. They're also your advocates. They're also your pseudo marketing department. They're also, you know, they're the ones who are going to help you potentially get funding. They're the ones who are going to be representative of you. So, you know, values trump all, in my opinion, and having people who not only share a common value, but also are passionate about what you're doing is so critically important.
I think one of the beauties of the open source world that we operate in is that you get the ability to, you know, to really see and identify and meet and get to understand, you know, key talent that's out there in the market within the community. And you know, in many ways, as I think back over my, you know, experience, a lot of the key engineering talent that we bring into organizations, we kind of know already before we even embark on a formal interview process that you know, they're going to be a strong fit for the organization. And to your point, Matt, you know, they bring a lot of, you know, you might get the right hires, they bring a lot of kudos, they bring a lot of talent, they bring a lot of, you know, ambition and foresight to you know, to the projects and to the business. I think just one word of caution to counter that. Again, just based on experience, just, you know, you get a lot of strong personalities in the open source community. You get a lot of strong individuals, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. But you know, sometimes that can be you know, counter to the culture that you are trying to build. So I would say, you know, one word of caution is that actually, when, you know, to the point Murielle brings up, you know, the cultural alignment is absolutely critical. But as I say, the beauty of the open source community is you can get a lot of the pre-work done before you even embark on formal interviews.
Yeah, and Paul, to your point there, some of the most intelligent people don't have, if they don't share your values, that can create a toxic environment and cause more harm than good. And often I've seen founders in early stage companies mistake intelligence for good fit. And you can have someone who is absolutely brilliant, has an impeccable resume, but let's be honest, they're just jerks. And you don't want to have, you know, the issue of having the smart jerk. You know, I mean, it's a problem. And I think that I've seen that too many times, that it derails your progress. And so people who fit your culture and are smart.
Yeah, and I think the smaller the organization, the more toxic that type of mistake can be.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that overall, as you grow, it becomes an interesting dynamic because every hire you make changes your culture, either for the better or for the worse. And early on, if you have two people and you add a third of your culture has the potential to change, right? So the earlier phase you are, the more your culture can shift with every hire.
Yeah.
And maybe there are people that you've worked with before as well, right? I see there's a comment around in the chat around old school friends. I would caveat, provided that you have worked together, because you can also have friends and, you know, might not be compatible. So looking into the communities, but also looking at previous colleagues, that's worked really well as well. In one of the startups I worked at, it was really, you know, people that had worked together, they knew what worked well, they knew what they needed, and bringing the person on board made sure they'd be able to trust them.
Yeah, and I think to that point, Murielle, I think my advice is never ever hire anybody you're not prepared to fire. And actually, go through that thought process before you even make an offer. And I've been in the situation where I've worked with friends and I've had to fire friends. You do not want to be in that situation unless you both go into it with your eyes very, very, very wide open. And then, the only other bit of advice I would have, which is, independent of open source, is whatever you go through a structured process, go through, just go through, structure the interview process, get second opinions, just really, really challenge yourself. No matter how well you know these individuals, you can't do, you can't do too little due diligence, is my experience. The mistakes I've made, and I've made quite a few mistakes from a hiring process, when I think about it, it's when I've been rushed, it's when I've been under pressure, it's when I haven't sought second opinions, where where I've liked somebody as opposed to really thought about whether they're capable of doing a job. That they generally are the hiring mistakes that I made looking back on my experience.
Well, isn't the old adage hire slow, fire fast? Is that what it is?
I think that's perfect.
Yeah. So take your time, do the due diligence. Yeah.
So, I mean, we absolutely need to get into that topic about how one builds a robust, repeatable hiring process. But in open source, there's this almost misnomer, in my opinion, that we'll just hire from the community, right? It's not an endless pool of talent, but also not a given assumption that just because someone is an active contributor, actively contributing to an open source project that you've built a company around, that they're going to want to come to work for your organization. So it's both how do you find talent, as well as then how do you attract that talent, given how competitive the market is today, and how does that differ at the different stages of the growth that we're seeing. So I think we should start by thinking about at the very smallest, so looking at Matt, and then moving on to the Red Hats and French startups, and now JetStack, and sort of talking through that.
Well, so hiring from community is awesome if you have a community, and as you're starting your project, GitHub is littered with projects that have one contributor, and it's probably the founder, and so it's hard to hire from that community if it's a single person. But if you are growing the community and you have attracted folks, it is a great tool, because what it enables you to do is it enables you to have some sort of verification to see what they're doing, where their thoughts are, what sort of PRs are they submitting, what sort of bugs. You can look at the code that they have contributed. So I think that is a valuable tool, but you need to care and feed for it. And again, it gets back to that labor of love early on in a company's phase. And what's funny is, as you start to work on your projects and as you start to work with the community, it reflects on how you as a founder will be viewed by others. So if you treat them well in those early processes, they're going to want to work for you. They're going to refer friends. They're going to tell people. They're going to become your little evangelists, that are going out there telling people about the cool things. And when you need someone, they can be the powerful recruiters that you need, as opposed to paying some external source. I can tell you that our best hires are referrals from our either community or our employees, because they're known quantities. They're doing the sales pitch basically for the positions for us. And so being able to effectively tap into that community is incredibly valuable, but it also is a great enabler, right? It balances the scales into the smaller companies' favor, because I'll listen to a friend or someone I know and trust before I'll listen to a recruiter or listen to a job ad on LinkedIn. And so having that, strong communities, critically important. And I think it's a great facilitator into the hiring process and being able to bring on people quickly.
One thing I'd add to that, I completely second everything, right? Because I went through that as well. We were quite lucky with the OpenStack technologies that there's the OpenStack Foundation, and so you can post jobs. There's a whole board, so there's a really structured community that really helped in that instance. And as I mentioned previously, for software engineers, for example, I never had to post an ad. I actually had more candidates at times than jobs and vetted candidates. So I absolutely second that. The other thing that I'd add is, if you're adding, how you have these really talented individuals, chances are they can share what they're doing with others. And so, for example, they may be experts in deploying the technology as well and write blogs around how they're going about it, right? I've had candidates on the phone who would tell me, I applied to your job because I know this person. His blogs has helped me to really come to terms and really grasp that technology. And if he works at your company, then I want to work here too. So really also having your people share their expertise out there, being it really visible, can also bring people. That's what I would add. And then the third piece to it is, if you want your employees, your people to really be your best ambassadors, then it's also about how you build, goes back to building your culture. One of my the startup I worked at when I joined, I was told, yes, so obviously we want our employees to be productive and high performing, but also what we want is for them to have fun. So your job is also to make sure that people are having fun. And that created an incredible culture. And our people were very proud of saying, come work for us. So that's also another thing I'd add.
Yeah, I mean, I'd second everything that has been said already. To me, it's network. Whether that be your open source community, whether it be your LinkedIn network, whether it be whomever, all of the best hires I've ever made have been through my network. I think as a startup, working with an outside recruiter is just, to be frank, the costs are just prohibitive. And that you are forced to a point where you have to hire from your network, and the wider and the deeper your network is, the more the more quality, the greater the number of candidates that you'll have access to. And generally, my experience is that it does work. It works pretty well if you put time and effort in building your network. And that's not just important for recruiting. That's important for absolutely everything. LinkedIn is, you can get a job onto LinkedIn. Post jobs on there. That's not overly burdensome in terms of costs and time, and you can make a pretty good job by building that network. Certainly from my experience. So, but I've also been faced with using recruiters as well. When you've got nothing, when there's just nothing there, sometimes there is a time and place where you do need some additional help, because, like you say, it's a tough market to get really the right people coming through. So there are times and places where you have to just suck it up, and that's also important, to build a good relationship with a recruiter that you trust and can actually work with. I think, again, you don't want to be backed into a corner when all of a sudden you need somebody and you can't find somebody and you don't have that relationship with a recruiter. So again, that takes time, and over the years you'll find people who you generally do trust.
One thing to add to the network thing is, don't be afraid to ask. Many people are afraid to ask for help, and so if there are positions you're having difficulty filling, or you're not sure, maybe it's outside of your skill set, you might know some other people in your network who have, or I've worked with this person, they're great. And I think sometimes as humans we get shy. So sometimes in open source space, not so shy, but it happens where we get shy. And I have had so many great conversations and hires from just going to someone that I know and respect and say, hey, do you know anybody who's done this type of thing? I've never done it before. And they're like, oh, you should talk to this other person. And so the network of the network is also your friend.
And so, our networks tend to be sort of very much local, or sort of reaching tends to be in America or other sort of similar places to where we're from. But the beauty of an open source community is you can have contributors all over the world, and the process of hiring people from different geographical locations with their different cultural and legal nuances is one of the most interesting challenges that I've seen, specifically at Elastic, which was a 100% remote company. And, at one point there was sort of 70 plus countries represented when a company's all hands took place. I should imagine you've all been party to hiring people from all parts of the world. When do you think a company can reach a level of maturity to be able to do that? And what do they need to really take into consideration when starting to look at international talent? Murielle, I think Stephanie first start on that.
Yeah, that's I think the when is kind of a hard one, because it really depends on what you're looking for, right? If you're looking at a really specific skill set that you really need, a technical talent, then maybe it can be very early on, right? Because it's something that you absolutely require. If you're thinking about, I don't know, maybe you have your product requires a support, then maybe you're going to international talent more for managing time zones, right? So it really depends on what you're looking for, the when you start. But the thing that I would really, really encourage you to do is understand, what you're getting yourself into in terms of the way, for example, first of all, to employ the person, whether it's going to be a contractor or whether you need to set up some type of payroll office, go through a third party. There's different ways of employing people abroad. But I think what you really need to understand is what does that mean in terms of that employment relationship? And if it doesn't work out, how easily can you get out of it? Because it will completely differ from one country to country. So really doing your homework there is really important.
Any countries in the world where you think it leans themselves to very easy to find fantastic talent and just a very easy place to hire from?
Yeah, well, the US has an incredible talent pool, and I'll let Matt speak to that because he will know this a lot more than me, but it's also more costly. In Europe, we often think about Eastern Europe, where there are, some great talents as well, but it also comes with language, sometimes differences and cultural differences that you need to take into account. I'm French, and France has some fantastic open source talent, but it's also a really complex country when it comes to employment law. So this is the one where, you've got an incredible pool of engineers and a lot of passion for open source there, but that's where it's going to get a lot more complicated. But Spain as well has a lot of startups and has a lot of really good tech talent as well. So Spain can be, and it's not too difficult as well when it comes to, if things don't work out. So that might be another country you want to explore.
Matt, any thoughts on that?
So we have had great success in South America with engineering talent. We find that it's generally an undertapped market for really, really, really good qualified folks. We've hired quite a bit in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and had a lot of success there. Of course, the US it's as complicated as France is, I think, in terms of like employment law and getting things set up in some cases. But we've also had a lot of success in Canada and Mexico. And of course, depending on where in Asia, you can have, good things and bad things in terms of, getting things set up and going. In the early stages, though, I tend to follow more of a find a way, make a way type of mentality when it comes to, finding the talent. If there is somebody who I know is going to be critical to my project, to my business, we're going to find a way to make that relationship work. And that often will move into things like, is there a third party intermediary? There's a lot of companies whose only job it is to employ someone in a country and then contract them back to you. Now, of course, then that gets into questions about, the perks and equity and other things, but there are ways to work that out that we've found, depending on the countries and the setup as well. But I think all over the world, there is ways to make, these relationships work. It just, is it worth the cost and effort? And in a lot of cases, in these early phases, it's probably going to be somebody who is really critical to your company. And then as you grow, recommendation is to pick a couple of places that make the most sense and focus on those areas. For us, like I said, in the South American market, we have a vibrant community there. They have a culture all their own, and they get together, several times a year just to hang out and be part of, that team there. And if you can foster those areas around the world, that's a really powerful thing for you as well, because it helps you in the recruiting, but it also helps keep people, because we talk a lot about hiring and recruiting folks. There's also a big retention play, because when you hire smart people get recruited by other people too.
Yeah, no, I think that all of that makes an awful lot of sense. I think the one variable I would throw out there, certainly in the very, very early stages, is also look at it from a customer-centric perspective. In the very, very early stages, as a business, you should be 100% focused on customers. You're making your customers happy, delivering a product that's delivering value, whatever it happens to be. And those early employees, whether you like it or not, they're going to get sucked into some sort of customer engagement from a technology engineering perspective. And I think as long as you have that, give that consideration some thought in terms of the geographical location, the language, all of those types of things, the time zones, all that, and it works, then it's academic. But I would, think in the vast majority of the cases, it does help to have people who are in the same time zone, that that you're focused on customers that people understand, those types of issues. Completely get it. As you scale, I think it becomes less and less important. But I think those first 2 or 3 hires, that there's definitely a benefit to having, same time zone, same language, same cultural understanding, same understanding of the customers. Those types of considerations are important.
Yes, and what we've seen as well a lot in some of the companies I've worked at as well is you sometimes expand, you go into another country because you want to be close to your customer as well. So that might be something to your point, Paul, where really you want to maybe there's a language barrier. Your customers may want to only speak with someone who knows them, knows their language, knows their culture. So that might be a reason to expand. So absolutely, it's a great point.
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration, and it's interesting. I think all of us are increasingly working for remote organisations, or as I'm actually increasingly told now, virtual organisations, because remote implies that there is a headquarters and you're remote from it. So now I'm working for virtual organisations as opposed to remote organisations.
So, and ultimately, Murielle, whilst this doesn't necessarily, it's not specific to an open source organization, right? There are a variety of sort of almost table stakes you need to consider when hiring people, right, around employment law and contracts. How can someone who may never have hired someone before actually enable themselves and skill themselves up in a way to ensure they're going to have a very successful process and protect themselves and the company that they're looking to build?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we know as well that sometimes as well, in terms of legal advice, it can get really, really expensive too. So in the early days, you'll be concerned about this. So I would say one service that's been really helpful for me in one of the startups I worked at is a bit of an all package, right? You get some advice on your policies, health and safety, whatever it is, the things that you need to put in place, the contracts and so on. And you can get access as well to support hotlines, for actually, costs that aren't too expensive. So for example, in the UK, you've got a company called Peninsula. They're quite effective for you if you know nothing about the topic and you just need to have someone that you can call to verify certain things. They also keep all of your contracts for you in their database, so they know exactly where your policies are at, your contracts and so on, and can use that as well to answer your questions. So that's one thing I'd recommend, for example.
And then we've all been through sort of massive change and scaling, and we've talked about the boom in tech and open source and the money that's flown around over the last decade or so. Scaling is hard. Continuing raising the bar with hires and ensuring you're keeping that culture as you choose to grow. If you could go back and look at some of the scaling processes that you've been through, what would you have done differently, and what actually went particularly well? Matt, I'll let you pick that one off.
Sure. I think that one of the things that with scaling that you come to realize after you go through several rounds of it is it never ends. So you're going to hit plateaus where everything breaks, and that's okay, right? What works for 10 people doesn't work for 100. What works for 100 doesn't work for 200, right? And I think that the evolution of your organization is going to take some wild and woolly turns, but it is important that as you start to scale, you do protect the culture and the values you have. There's going to be a very powerful pull to hire folks who have been there, done that, or worked at a real company, or worked at someone that's at larger scale. And you might make trade-offs and say, like, well, they haven't worked at an open source company, maybe they don't have our values, but we'll train our values into them. And I think that those types of hires, while they can bring some value to the table, you have to be very careful. I mentioned every hire changes the culture, and I've seen that firsthand. And I think that there's been times when I have been less protective of the culture than I should have been, and that has hurt the team and set us back, maybe several steps, because you start to think, oh, well, I have to run this a certain way. I have to make this more like, a proper company, and not a startup, because we're out of the startup phase. And, that doesn't mean that you should sacrifice some of those core things that are important to you. And, a lot of it is realizing that there's a human element, even as you scale and get bigger, and you're only as good as the teams that you build and the people you have. And winning, people's hearts and minds, especially when it comes to change, scale, and growth, is so critical, because that's what's going to drive your company forward. It's a very people-centric company. And I can tell you firsthand, hey, there were processes that I, knew would change for the better of the company, but I didn't spend the time getting the teams to buy into those. And because of that, it caused turnover, it caused attrition, because people didn't understand why we were changing. And so winning the hearts and minds as you grow and scale, and as the company changes, is going to be critically important, because otherwise you're going to lose those people that you value and that have brought you to the place where you can grow and scale.
The why is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, I mean, Red Hat, probably the largest open source organization. What was the scaling journey like there? What did you take from it that you think people who aspire to be of that size?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. When I joined Red Hat, we were still selling mugs and magazines and T-shirts. That's how the company was making its money, and it really took a few quarters for the enterprise, the subscription business model to really land and to really take off. I think what you saw in the early stages was, and this is true for any organization, I think is really trying to understand what is the business model, what is the scale here, how can we bring value to customers, and then once you've got that, once you start to get indications that you've got that secret sauce, then you can start to build the machine which actually scales it. I think whilst Red Hat had done a lot of the hard work up front, what we see in open source in particular is that it tends to be a services-led business model to start off with, i.e. you have a really interesting open source technology, you find some customers who are using it and they're using it in critical situations, you can deliver services around it, you get engineering talent that really delivers some sort of value on top of that. And then actually you start to see the green shoots of a product. You start to see the green shoots of something that's scalable. And that you go then on a sort of a product journey. So you go from this services, and then all of a sudden you've got something which you can start to scale. And I've seen that, a few times. And with those early people, what you want utility players, you want people who are prepared to get stuck into everything and anything from an engineering perspective. But then as you start to go on the journey in terms of creating a product, that's actually when you can start to, sit back and start thinking about, okay, I need some specific job descriptions here. In the early stages when I'm employing people, the promise I give them is that I can't give you a job description. I can't give you 10 bullet points that you're going to do because it's going to be wrong next week. But what I can tell you about is the journey we're going to go on. I think that type of conversation is very, very different when you're a few years down the line and actually you're starting to think about, okay, I need some product management, I need some sales guys, I need some engineering talent that focuses on this specific areas. That's a very different that's a very different type of conversation that you would have with people. So I think in the early stages, you need people who are prepared for that journey, and you need to be able to articulate that journey pretty well. And I suspect you're going to find it's a services-led engagement, starting to find a product, moving then into scaling, and then really creating a machine which can scale that. Unfortunately, I was probably just a bit too late at Red Hat to really enjoy the real benefits of that journey. I think when I joined, we had the customers. We knew that this was really about building and scaling a sales machine. But the early stages is when you need people who are just prepared to get stuck into absolutely anything and everything from an engineering perspective to work out what is going to drive the scale of the business.
There was an engineer called Mark Harwood at Elastic, who it was very bittersweet. He was a fantastic engineer, and when he stopped going on to sort of as many client engagements that we were sort of always dragging him onto, he was both delighted and saddened at the same time. He could actually deliver what he'd been brought on to do, but was still missing some of that field time. Murielle, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was going to add a little bit on the hiring processes. I know when you're scaling, it means as well, you may not be part of the interview process for all of your hires. You may not be the person to extend the offer anymore. And so really making sure that as part of your scaling activity, you're really thinking about, you're enabling the right people, who can make these offers, and you trust them, and you've really spent that time to make sure you're all on the same page as to what good looks like in terms of culture fit, in terms of behavior. That's really key. It's something that we did as well. We went through that phase at a prior company, and we just basically spent a whole morning and workshop and really making sure that the co-founders felt very comfortable with specific leaders in the organization making those hiring decisions. And it was really daunting for them. It was not easy letting go of this aspect, but it really helped us really shorten as well our hiring process.
One thing I wanted to point out, as both Paul and Murielle, you were talking, as you grow, I think it's important for founders, for companies, especially in those growth phases, to realize that there are different types of people who will be part of the organization. Not everyone will be there for the whole journey. And some people are best for the early start phase, and then they're not good for, the next phase of growth or 2 phases down. I forget where I read this. I don't know if it was from Netflix or Facebook, but I read somewhere where someone had mentioned there are three types of people at organizations. One are the people that you hire to get you from point A to B. Another is someone who's going to morph and change to what you need, no matter what the time. And then the other is the person who's beyond the period that they should have been, and they're there because you like them, or they've been loyal, or they got you where you were. But just because they got you where you are today doesn't mean they can get you where you need to be tomorrow. And I think that part of that growth is also understanding the company change and understanding who might not be a good fit for the next phase of growth as well.
I think that's a very good point, actually. I completely agree. Going back to your original question, Lee, about what would be done differently, I think that would be identifying this earlier, because sometimes, it can carry on for a long period of time. So absolutely.
I think just to add to that, even you as a founder, I think that's also something that you need to look at yourself and think, actually, am I the right person to be taking the journey, leading the organization on the next stage? You may well be that person, but I think you'll find that the vast majority of founders at some point during the first few years will step back from that that CEO or that leadership role, when they recognize, actually, I'm not the best person to take this from B to C as opposed from A to B. So I think it's a very, very, very valid point in that.
And it's being conscious about all those things. For me, during the hiring process, the sort of the biggest advice that I was ever given was, can you see yourself spending 10 hours a day with this person? And it's a sort of a question that you have to ask and be very critical around, right? Really being analytical through the process. If you were to provide one piece of sort of advice to people making early critical hires, scaling out open source based organizations, what would they be? And Paul, I'll start with you.
I would, not specific to open source, but I think you take your time and be just very thoughtful, very diligent. You can't, in the early stages, you just don't want to make any mistakes. But if you do make a mistake, and if you hire enough people, you'll make mistakes. I guarantee it. You will know pretty quickly, and the best piece of advice I've ever been given is that if you make a mistake, you've got to correct that mistake pretty quickly.
Murielle?
Yeah, I would say so. Completely second that, and then one thing I'd add is feel free to interview as many candidates as you can, as well as you want, right? About taking your time, because sometimes through meeting those individuals is when you get a better picture as well of what you need. It might be that you don't really know, especially at the beginning, and it's through talking that you really analyze that. And then, yes, I think we all also hire with a little bit of gut feel, which is fine. It's fair enough. My technique when I interview is always, I've got my page separated in two parts. One is the objective side, what the person is saying. And the right side of my page is what I'm feeling throughout, what I'm getting. And what's really crucial for me is to make sure I understand objectively what is generating that feeling or that gut feel, because you don't want to be making hires purely on that. You want to understand what is it that's triggering that reaction, because otherwise you might make a bad decision. So I'll give you an example. I once had a candidate who was overly negative, and I was like, oh, it's bringing me down. Why is it? And then I realized, going back, was that every single situation that turned into something negative. But it was good for me to really identify what it was, because otherwise I was just like, oh, he's dragging me down, I don't know why. And it's just an impression. It's not how you make a hiring decision.
Matt?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, that to me, that both of these get back to the values and culture and how protective you have to be during the hiring process of those. It trumps everything else. I mean, obviously you need someone with the skill set to do the job, but you know, there are many people who can code. There are many people who have some really outstanding skills, but not everyone is going to match that, you know, passion that you need in the position. I would also encourage founders and executives to find mentors and coaches who have been there and done that. You don't have to go this alone. Yes, you're going to make mistakes, but you can learn from others, right? You're listening to this call, you're listening to this panel, so you're learning already, which is great. But I think that there are so many people out there, especially in the open source space, who are just willing to share their knowledge and willing to answer questions and help you out. Seek them out. Build a network of people you can talk to and rely on. That's going to be critical. And don't settle. You know, this gets back to, you know, like, you know, the hire slow or take your time. So many times I've gotten into a position, and it's always burned me, where, you know, the first person up, they went somewhere else. The second person went somewhere else. You're down to your like third or fourth person on the list, and you're like, well, I wasn't going to hire them, but I really need this job filled. It never works out. There's a reason that they're the fifth person on your list, right? So be, you know, focus on the passion, focus on the energy, and don't settle.
Fantastic. Thank you very much all for your time. Thank you very much, Open UK, for the 8th installment. And we're very much looking forward to the next one. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.